Yellowstone had always been a place of wonder for me, a spot on the map where the wild still held sway. When I got the call about the ranger position, I jumped at the chance. Fresh out of training, I couldn't wait to start. I thought I knew what to expect: beautiful scenery, long hikes, and maybe a few bears. But nothing had prepared me for what I was about to face. My first day started like any other. I checked in, met the other rangers, and grabbed my gear. The morning was spent patrolling the trails, making sure everything was in order. As the hours passed, I found myself growing more comfortable with the routine. The radio crackled with updates: bison near the West Trail, a few campers needing directions. It was all standard stuff. Then, in the afternoon, I got a call that made my heart skip a beat. A girl had been spotted near the North Trail, matching the description of Sarah Collins, the one who went missing over a decade ago. At first, I thought it was a mistake or some kind of prank. But the voice on the other end was serious, almost shaken. I felt a chill run down my spine as I grabbed my flashlight and headed in that direction. The North Trail was quieter than the others, less traveled by tourists. As I walked, the trees seemed to close in around me, and the air grew still. Every step felt heavier than the last. I tried to keep my mind on the task, reminding myself that it was probably just a lost camper. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I finally reached the spot where the girl had been seen, I stopped. There she was, standing just ahead, wearing a yellow dress that looked like it had seen better days. Her hair was a mess, and she seemed out of place, like a photograph from another time. I took a deep breath and called out to her. "Sarah?" I asked, though my voice wavered. The girl turned slowly, her eyes locking onto mine. I froze. There was something in her gaze that I couldn't explain, something that made me want to turn and run. My first instinct was to radio for help, but my hand wouldn't move. It was as if something held me in place, forcing me to stand there, staring at her. The girl didn't say anything, just kept looking at me with those eyes that seemed too knowing, too old. Finally, I managed to take a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound calm. She nodded, but there was something off about the way she moved, slow, deliberate, like she was thinking over every motion. I wanted to ask her more, but the words stuck in my throat. I felt a pull, an urge to move closer, though every part of me screamed to stay back. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been waiting for you." The way she said it sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just the words, but the certainty in them, as if she knew I would come, like this moment had been planned long before I arrived. "Waiting for me?" I echoed, unsure of what else to say. She nodded again, then turned and started walking away from the trail, deeper into the woods. I knew I should have stopped her, called for backup, done something to bring her back to safety. But instead, I found myself following her, unable to resist. The deeper we went, the more I felt like I was leaving something behind. The familiar sounds of the park faded, replaced by a silence that pressed down on me. I tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine, focusing on the girl's yellow dress, the only bright spot in the growing gloom. As we walked, I noticed that the trail had disappeared, and the trees grew thicker, their branches almost touching overhead. I had no idea where we were anymore, but the girl moved with purpose, like she knew exactly where she was leading me. I wanted to ask her again where we were going, but something told me it didn't matter. All I could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time. I began to lose track of time as we walked. It felt like we'd been moving for hours, but the sun hadn't shifted in the sky. My legs ached, but I couldn't stop. She never looked back at me, just kept moving, her bare feet almost gliding over the uneven ground. I tried to focus on my surroundings, looking for landmarks, anything that might help me find my way back. But every tree looked the same, and the path behind us had long disappeared. A sense of dread settled in my stomach. I wanted to call out to her again, demand she stop, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. I was the one who had come out here to help, to do my job, and now I was following a girl who didn't seem lost at all. It felt wrong, but I couldn't turn around. I was caught in her wake, pulled along by some unseen force. Suddenly, she stopped, and I nearly walked into her. She stood in front of a large tree, much older and bigger than the others around it. The bark was dark, almost black, and twisted in a way that made it look alive. She turned to me with that same eerie expression, her eyes locking onto mine. "This is the place," she said softly. Her voice was so calm, so certain, like she was sharing a secret. I stared at the tree, trying to understand what she meant. There was something carved into the bark, something I couldn't make out in the shadows. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, trying to see what was there. As I leaned in, the girl placed a hand on the tree, and the carving seemed to glow faintly. Symbols, strange and unfamiliar, stood out against the dark bark, pulsing with a soft light. I couldn't look away, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. The air around us felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name, and I realized I was holding my breath. "What is this?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely audible. She didn't answer, just looked at me with a sad smile. The light from the symbols grew brighter, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I stumbled back, but the girl stepped forward, her hand still on the tree, her gaze never leaving mine. I tried to move, to step away, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to break free. I stood there, paralyzed, as the light from the symbols on the tree began to pulse faster, matching the frantic beating of my heart. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing about this situation felt real. The girl's smile never wavered as she watched me struggle. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I could feel something pulling me closer to the tree, like an invisible force was drawing me in. My breaths came in shallow gasps, and I tried to focus on anything but the symbols glowing on the bark. But my eyes kept being drawn back, hypnotized by the strange patterns. Suddenly, the girl spoke again, her voice soft but clear. "It's been waiting for you, Mark. It knows you're here." My stomach dropped at her words. The way she said my name made it feel like she wasn't just a lost girl, but something else entirely, something that knew far more about me than it should. I forced myself to speak, my voice trembling. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" The girl didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped back, still watching me with those intense, unblinking eyes. The light from the tree seemed to grow brighter, casting eerie shadows around us. "You have to choose," she finally said, her tone almost gentle. "Stay here with me, or leave and never come back." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no explanation, no reason given, just that impossible choice. I didn't know what staying meant, but the thought of leaving without answers terrified me even more. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I tried to shake off the fog in my mind, to think clearly, but the pull of the tree was growing stronger. My thoughts became jumbled, fear and confusion mixing, until I could barely remember why I had come here in the first place. All I knew was that something terrible was about to happen, and I was powerless to stop it. The pressure in my head was unbearable, like something was squeezing my mind, forcing me to make a decision I didn't understand. The girl's gaze never wavered, and her presence felt like a weight on my chest. I could hardly breathe, my thoughts spinning out of control. I needed to get out of there, but the force holding me in place was too strong. I tried to move, to take even a single step backward, but my body refused to respond. It was as if the earth itself had latched onto my feet, rooting me in place. Panic surged through me, and I struggled harder, desperate to break free from whatever hold this place had on me. But the harder I fought, the tighter the grip became. The girl's voice broke through my frantic thoughts. "You're almost out of time, Mark." Her words sent a chill down my spine, and I knew she wasn't lying. I had to do something, anything, to get away from that tree, but every option seemed to lead to something worse. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, not just by her, but by something far more sinister. In that moment of desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I closed my eyes and forced myself to focus on my breathing, trying to block out the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. I pictured myself somewhere else, anywhere but there. I didn't care where, as long as it was far away from that clearing, far from the girl, and far from the unnatural force holding me captive. I felt a shift beneath me, a slight loosening of the invisible grip that had pinned me in place. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I opened my eyes and saw the girl watching me with a mix of curiosity and something else. Disappointment, maybe? I didn't dwell on it. I summoned every ounce of strength left in me and took a step back. The moment my foot moved, the spell seemed to break. I stumbled backward, then turned and ran, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that cursed clearing. The trees blurred past me, and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back until I was far enough away that the suffocating pressure finally lifted, leaving me gasping for breath in the middle of the forest. The cabin creaked under the weight of my footsteps as I packed my gear. Yellowstone had been my home for years, both as a ranger and now in retirement. The peace of the woods was comforting, but news of my old friend's disappearance changed that. He wasn't the type to wander off or get lost. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling. I decided to search the area he was last seen. It wasn't far from my place, just a few miles into the trees. I grabbed my old ranger jacket, a flashlight, and my hunting rifle. Even though I wasn't on duty anymore, my instincts kicked in. The sun was starting to set, painting everything in a deep orange glow. I'd spent countless evenings in these woods, but tonight felt different. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it had become. The usual sounds, birds, rustling leaves, were gone. It was like the forest was holding its breath. My friend and I used to joke about the eerie stillness that sometimes settled over the park, but this was something else. It was like stepping into a place where I wasn't welcome. I pushed forward, following a faint trail. My friend knew these woods as well as I did, so he wouldn't have strayed too far from the path. But the deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following me. It was just nerves, I told myself, just nerves. Then out of nowhere, I found something that made my blood run cold. A small clearing where the ground was disturbed. It looked like something had been dragged through here, something heavy. I knelt down, touching the earth. It was damp, but not with rain. Blood, dried, but unmistakable. I knew this wasn't a good sign, and a knot formed in my stomach. I stood up slowly, trying to piece together what could have happened. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I was no longer just looking for my friend. I was on guard, every sense heightened. The shadows around me seemed to stretch and shift as the last light of day slipped away. I wasn't alone out here, and whatever was out there, it wasn't friendly. I kept moving, trying to push the thought of what I'd found out of my mind, but the image of the blood wouldn't leave me. The trail it left was faint, almost lost among the leaves and roots, but it was there if you knew what to look for. I followed it, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't how I'd imagined my quiet life in Yellowstone would turn out. As I went deeper, the trees seemed to close in around me. The air grew colder, sharp with the smell of pine and something else, something metallic. I tightened my grip on the rifle. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I knew I had to be ready for anything. My friend was out here somewhere, and I wasn't going to leave until I found him, or whatever was left of him. After a while, I noticed something hanging from one of the trees. I approached it slowly, my steps careful. When I got close enough, I saw that it was an old piece of cloth, torn and dirty, caught on a branch. It looked like it had been there for a while, but it was the same color as the jacket my friend always wore. I reached up, taking it down, turning it over in my hands. There were small tears in the fabric, like it had been ripped by something sharp. I didn't want to think about what that meant, but I couldn't ignore it. Whatever happened here wasn't just an accident. Someone or something had done this, and they weren't far. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but I kept going. The trail led me further into the woods, where the trees grew thicker and the shadows deeper. Every step felt like it was taking me closer to something I didn't want to face. The sound of running water reached my ears, faint but clear. I followed it, hoping it might lead to some clue, maybe even to my friend. The stream wasn't far, a small trickle cutting through the forest, but what I found there made my heart skip a beat. Footprints, half washed away by the water, leading to the edge of the stream and disappearing into the brush. They were too large to be from any animal around here. I crouched down, touching the mud, fresh, like someone had passed through recently. I straightened up, scanning the trees around me. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost overwhelming. I wasn't sure if I should keep going or turn back, but something drove me forward. Maybe it was loyalty to my friend, or maybe it was just that I needed to know what happened. Either way, I knew there was no turning back now. I followed the footprints, careful not to make any noise. The forest had gone quiet. The usual sounds of birds and small animals were absent. It was unsettling, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. My pulse quickened with every step, the weight of the rifle in my hands a small comfort. I kept my eyes on the ground, tracking the faint marks in the dirt. They led me through a thicket of dense brush where the branches clawed at my jacket and scratched my skin. I came to a small clearing, the trees parting just enough to let a bit of light through. In the center, something was half buried under leaves and dirt. I approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. As I got closer, I realized it was a backpack, torn open, its contents scattered across the ground. It was my friend's, the one he always carried with him on patrol. The sight of it sent a wave of dread through me. I crouched down, sifting through the debris. There were food wrappers, a map, a flashlight with dead batteries, and a notebook with the pages torn out, but there was no sign of my friend. I stood up, glancing around the clearing. The footprints were gone, lost in the soft earth. It was like whoever, or whatever, had been here didn't want to be found. I stayed there for a moment, trying to figure out my next move. The silence pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was out there, watching me. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on the tree line. Every instinct was telling me to leave, to get out while I still could. But I couldn't, not without answers. Taking a deep breath, I turned and started back the way I came, determined to find something, anything that would lead me to my friend. The forest felt different now, more sinister. Each snap of a twig, each rustle of leaves put me on edge, but I pushed forward, driven by a need to uncover the truth. As I continued deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and the trees seemed to press in on me. The path I was following became harder to see, overgrown with roots and brambles. My mind raced with questions. Where was my friend? What had happened to him? But the forest offered no answers, only an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I gripped my rifle tighter, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Then I noticed something strange. The ground beneath my feet began to feel uneven, almost as if it was giving way. I looked down and saw the earth shifting, like something was moving underneath it. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back, but the ground continued to churn, forming a shallow depression. My gut twisted with dread, and I aimed my rifle at the spot, half expecting something to emerge from below. Suddenly, the earth stopped moving. I waited, my pulse hammering in my ears, but nothing happened. The silence was oppressive, heavy with anticipation. I took a cautious step forward, peering into the depression. That's when I saw it, a hand, pale and lifeless, sticking out from the dirt. My stomach lurched as I realized what I was looking at. I dropped to my knees and began frantically digging with my hands, dirt flying in all directions. As I unearthed more of the body, I recognized the tattered uniform, the familiar features. It was my friend, or what was left of him. His face was frozen in a look of terror, his eyes wide open as if he had seen something unimaginable in his final moments. My heart sank, a mix of sorrow and horror washing over me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from his lifeless form, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me like a lead blanket. But I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed to report this to get help. I stood up, my hands shaking, and backed away from the grave. As I turned to leave, a sudden noise made me freeze in my tracks. It was a low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from somewhere behind me. My blood ran cold, and I slowly turned around, the sense of being watched returning with full force. I barely had time to process what I was seeing before the growl deepened, vibrating through the trees. I spun around, scanning the shadows for the source. The forest, usually full of life, felt abandoned. My friend's lifeless body seemed like a magnet, pulling something toward us, something I couldn't see but could feel closing in. The air grew thicker, and my pulse quickened. Whatever it was close, and it wanted me to stay. A branch snapped behind me, and I whipped around, raising my rifle. I saw nothing, just the dark outlines of trees, but I knew better than to trust my eyes. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get away from that place, but my legs refused to move. It felt like the forest itself was holding me there, forcing me to confront whatever horror lurked just out of sight. Then I heard it again, another growl, closer this time, almost right behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I took a step back, slowly, trying to keep my movements controlled, but every instinct I had screamed danger. As I moved, I caught a glimpse of something between the trees, an outline, a shadow that didn't belong. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of it. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. It was waiting, watching, deciding what to do with me. The air felt electric, charged with a fear so intense I could taste it. My breathing became shallow as I struggled to keep calm. I knew I couldn't stay there, but I also knew that running would only trigger whatever this thing was. I needed to move slowly, carefully, and not provoke it. Gathering every ounce of courage, I began to back away, keeping my rifle aimed at the figure. My hands trembled, but I steadied them, focusing on getting out alive. The thing didn't follow, but I could feel its presence, a heavy weight pressing on my chest. It felt like it was daring me to make a wrong move. I took another step, then another, inching toward the direction I had come from, never taking my eyes off where I had seen it. Finally, when I felt like I was far enough, I turned and ran. I ran faster than I ever had, the forest blurring around me as I sprinted toward safety. The growls faded behind me, but the fear clung to me like a second skin. Even when I reached the edge of the woods, I didn't stop. I didn't stop until I was back at my cabin, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Whatever that thing was, it had let me go, but I knew it wasn't over. It was out there, waiting, and it had marked me. The sun was setting as we pulled into the parking lot at Yellowstone, and the air had a bite to it, signaling the arrival of fall. I could see my breath as I unloaded my gear from the truck, the familiar weight of the rifle comforting in my hands. My friends, all seasoned hunters like me, were joking around, but there was a tension beneath the surface. Night hunts were always a different beast, and we all knew it. We set out on foot, flashlights cutting through the dimming light as we made our way into the forest. The trees around us were tall, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the remaining sunlight. The ground was uneven, and we had to watch our step as we moved deeper into the woods. Every now and then, we'd stop, listen to the silence, and then continue on, the only sounds coming from our footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was irrational, I told myself, just the nerves that come with being out here in the dark. But the feeling lingered, a prickling at the back of my neck that I couldn't ignore. I kept my flashlight steady, scanning the trees, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just shadows and more shadows, stretching out in every direction. We reached a clearing after what felt like hours of walking. The moon had risen by then, casting a pale light over everything. The trees stood like silent sentinels around us, their branches barely moving in the still air. I paused, taking in the scene, trying to push down the unease that had been growing since we started. It was quiet, too quiet, and that only made the feeling worse. "Let's set up here for a bit," I said, trying to sound calm. The others nodded, and we huddled together, backs to each other, eyes scanning the tree line. It was then that I first heard it. A faint sound, like something moving in the distance, but I couldn't tell what it was. I strained to listen, heart beating faster, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. We sat there in the clearing, trying to shrug off the strange feeling that had settled over us. One of my friends, Mike, cracked a joke about how we were probably just hearing squirrels or something. The others laughed, but it sounded forced. I knew they felt it too, the unease that hung in the air, pressing down on us. I turned my attention back to the trees, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting eerie shapes on the ground. I couldn't shake the sense that something was out there, just beyond the reach of our lights. My fingers tightened around the rifle, the weight of it suddenly feeling less reassuring than before. As the minutes ticked by, the silence grew heavier, almost oppressive. We all stayed still, listening intently for anything that might break the quiet. That's when it happened again, the sound, only louder this time. It was closer, but still too faint to pinpoint. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the snap of a twig. It was something else, something I couldn't quite place. I exchanged a glance with Mike, and I could see the tension in his eyes. He wasn't laughing anymore. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, barely loud enough for the others to hear. They nodded, eyes wide, every one of us straining to listen. The sound came again, followed by another, like something moving through the underbrush, slow and deliberate. Without a word, we all stood, flashlights pointed toward the direction of the noise. My heart was pounding in my chest as we slowly moved toward the trees, trying to make out what was making the sound. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal, maybe, but the sounds didn't fit. It was something else, something that didn't belong out here. We stopped at the edge of the clearing, flashlights sweeping through the darkness. The sounds had stopped, and now there was nothing but the heavy breathing of 4 men trying to keep their cool. We stood there for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, but the feeling of being watched never left me. We stayed at the edge of the clearing, not saying a word, just listening. The silence wasn't comforting. It felt like the calm before a storm. Every muscle in my body was tense, waiting for something to break the stillness. I kept my flashlight trained on the trees, but nothing moved. The air was thick, and I could feel the sweat starting to bead on my forehead despite the cool night. Suddenly, a branch snapped off to our left. We all spun toward the sound, flashlights shaking as we tried to see what caused it. I caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, a flicker of movement, but it was gone before I could focus. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just passing through, it was watching us. Mike whispered, "Did you see that?" His voice was tight, almost strained. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The others were silent, but I knew they were just as freaked out as I was. We were experienced outdoorsmen, but this was different. There was a sense of dread hanging over us, and it was getting harder to ignore. We decided to move back toward the campsite, staying close together. Our steps were cautious, and every sound we made seemed too loud, too exposed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following us. But the woods remained still, as if holding its breath. The darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides, making it hard to tell where the trees ended and shadows began. As we walked, the noises picked up again. They weren't consistent, just a rustle here, a snap there, but they were enough to keep us on edge. Each sound set off a new wave of anxiety, like we were being toyed with. I tightened my grip on my rifle, feeling the cold metal against my palm, a reminder that we weren't completely defenseless. But for the first time in my life, it didn't feel like enough. By the time we reached the camp, we were all on edge. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint, flickering light over our tents. We gathered around it, not saying much. The tension was thick, and no one seemed eager to break the silence. I sat down, staring into the dying flames, trying to convince myself that it was all in our heads. But the memory of those sounds and that shadowy figure wouldn't let me rest. We huddled around the dying campfire, trying to shake off the lingering fear. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, and sleep was a distant dream. I kept my flashlight close, its beam now a small comfort in the dark. Every crackle of the embers seemed louder than usual, piercing the silence with a sharpness that made my nerves jump. As the hours dragged by, the sounds from earlier grew more distant, but they didn't disappear. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I'd glance around, expecting to see someone or something lurking just beyond the edge of the light. But each time, I only saw trees and darkness. Mike tried to make light of the situation, cracking jokes and laughing nervously, but his attempts to lighten the mood fell flat. The rest of us just sat there, too uneasy to respond. The unease was so thick, it felt like it could be cut with a knife. None of us spoke much, our eyes darting around the campsite as if expecting the shadows to come to life. At some point, Tom suggested we get some rest. We reluctantly agreed, knowing we needed to be alert for the morning. I crawled into my sleeping bag, but sleep came slowly. Every rustle and shift in the forest seemed amplified, echoing in my mind. My flashlight was within reach, and I kept it on, though it barely cut through the darkness of the tent. Just as I started to drift off, a loud thump from outside made me sit up straight. My heart pounded as I reached for my rifle, straining to hear through the fabric of the tent. The sound was followed by a strange, low growl that seemed to come from all around us. I looked at my friends, their faces as pale as mine, and knew we were all thinking the same thing. We were not alone. The night passed in a restless vigil. Every so often, a new sound would send us scrambling for our gear, but each time, we'd find nothing but the same oppressive darkness. By dawn, we were exhausted, but the sense of dread didn't lift. We packed up quickly, eager to leave the campsite behind, and headed back to the trail, hoping to put the terror of the night behind us. But the forest still seemed to hold its breath, waiting for us to leave. We made our way back to the trail, the weight of the previous night hanging heavy on our shoulders. The forest seemed different in the daylight, but the earlier sense of unease lingered. The trees no longer felt like silent watchers, but they still held a certain oppressive weight, as if they were hiding something just out of sight. As we walked, we tried to piece together what we had experienced. The sounds, the shadows, none of it made sense. We had hoped that by returning to the trail, we'd be able to make sense of the night's events, but the clarity we sought remained elusive. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves seemed to remind us of the fear we couldn't shake off. When we finally reached the truck, there was a collective sigh of relief. We loaded our gear and climbed inside, the safety of the vehicle a welcome contrast to the oppressive forest. We drove in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The drive back was long, and the weight of our experience seemed to stretch time itself. Back in town, we avoided talking about the night's events. It was as if mentioning it would make it more real, and none of us wanted to confront that possibility. The forest had given us a night of terror that would stay with us forever, but discussing it out loud felt like it would give it power we weren't willing to acknowledge. As days turned into weeks, the memory of that night faded into the background of our lives, but it never fully disappeared. Every time I stepped into the woods, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. The forest had shown us a side of itself that defied explanation, and though I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the mind, I knew deep down that some secrets of Yellowstone were better left unexplored. When we first moved to Yellowstone, it was meant to be a fresh start. My daughter, Hyunju, and I were trying to leave behind the life we once knew in South Korea. She had always been a quiet child, but after her mother left, that quietness turned into complete silence. I hoped the peace of the forest would help us both heal. Our new home was small but cozy, surrounded by towering trees. Hyunju seemed to enjoy the change, or at least she didn't seem unhappy. She would spend hours in the backyard, playing by herself, her little hands digging in the dirt or stacking rocks. I would watch her from the window, trying to read her expressions, but she always kept that same blank face, like she was lost in her own world. One afternoon, I noticed something strange. Hyunju was standing very still, her gaze fixed on something beyond the trees. I called out to her, but she didn't respond, didn't even turn her head. I walked outside, trying to see what had caught her attention, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of forest. When I finally touched her shoulder, she jumped, as if waking from a dream. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place, fear, maybe, or confusion. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Hyunju standing so still, so focused on something invisible, kept replaying in my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just a child's imagination, but deep down, I felt uneasy. There was something about this place, something I couldn't quite put into words. I tried to brush it off, but that sense of unease lingered, like a shadow following me wherever I went. The next day, I asked Hunju about what she saw. She didn't answer, of course. She never did. But she took my hand and led me to the edge of the yard, pointing silently into the woods. I looked, straining my eyes to see whatever she was trying to show me. But there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the breeze. Yet, the way she stood there, so insistent, made my skin crawl. It was as if she knew something I didn't, something hidden in the depths of the forest. After that first unsettling encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I watched Hunju closely, hoping to see if she would mention anything about what she saw, but she remained quiet as always. Yet there was something different about her. She spent more time near the edge of the yard, her eyes fixed on the trees as if waiting for something or someone to appear. I tried to distract her with games and stories, but her attention always drifted back to the woods. It was as if the forest had cast a spell on her, pulling her closer with each passing day. I started to feel uneasy whenever I looked out the window and saw her standing there, motionless, just staring. I knew I had to keep her safe, but I didn't know how to fight something I couldn't see. One evening, after I had put Hunju to bed, I heard a soft tapping on the window. It was subtle at first, almost like the wind, but it grew louder and more distinct. I approached the window cautiously, expecting to see an animal or a branch brushing against the glass. But there was nothing. The yard was empty, and the trees stood silent and still, their dark forms blending into the night. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the tapping continued. It was steady and rhythmic, almost like someone was trying to get my attention. I pressed my ear against the glass, trying to make sense of it, but all I could hear was the tapping, persistent and unyielding. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that it was coming from within the walls, not outside. That night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed amplified, every creak of the house a reminder that we were not alone. I kept checking on Hunju, worried that whatever was out there might try to reach her again. She slept peacefully, unaware of the fear that had taken hold of me, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was trying to make contact, and I had to figure out what it wanted before it was too late. The following morning, I woke up feeling uneasy, the remnants of a sleepless night weighing heavily on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Hyunju, however, seemed unaffected. She went about her usual routine, but her eyes often drifted to the window, to the trees that bordered our yard. I could see that whatever was calling to her was growing stronger, pulling her toward the forest with an invisible force. I decided to keep her inside that day. I told her it was because of the rain, though the skies were clear. She didn't protest, but there was a sadness in her eyes that cut through me. She kept glancing at the door, as if expecting someone to knock. Her silence spoke volumes, and I felt powerless against the force that seemed to be taking hold of her. As the day wore on, I became more and more restless. The house felt too small, too quiet. Every little sound made me jump, creaks in the floorboards, the rustle of leaves outside, even the ticking of the clock. I could feel the presence of something lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for the right moment to make its move. The sense of dread hung over me like a dark cloud, growing heavier with each passing hour. That evening, I decided to confront whatever was out there. I couldn't sit by and do nothing while it slowly crept closer to my daughter. I armed myself with a flashlight and a knife, the only things I could think of that might offer some protection. I told Hunju to stay inside and locked the doors behind me as I stepped out into the yard. The air was cold and the night was eerily still. As I approached the tree line, the feeling of being watched intensified. My heartbeat pounded in my ears and I could barely keep my hands steady. I scanned the area with my flashlight, searching for any sign of movement, but the forest remained silent. The tapping noise from the night before echoed in my mind, making me question my sanity. But I knew something was out there, and it was getting closer. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I caught a glimpse of something. A flicker of light deep within the woods. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there. I took a step forward, then another, driven by a mix of fear and determination. I had to know what was calling to my daughter, what had been tapping at our walls. But as I ventured further into the forest, the light disappeared, leaving me alone in the darkness with only the sound of my own breathing to keep me company. The deeper I went into the forest, the thicker the fog became. It wrapped around me like a shroud, making it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. I tried to stay calm, but the silence was unsettling. Every now and then, a distant snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves made me jump. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, its beam barely piercing the dense mist. The light I had seen before was now gone, leaving me in near-complete darkness. My breath came in quick bursts as I pushed forward, my thoughts a jumble of worry and fear. I kept calling out to whatever was out there, but my voice was swallowed by the thick fog. I felt like I was walking in circles, the trees and shadows playing tricks on my eyes. Then I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There, just a few feet ahead, was an old abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been deserted for years, its windows shattered and the door hanging off its hinges. A chill ran down my spine. This must have been where the light had come from. The place looked sinister, as if it was hiding something dark and dangerous. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But then I thought of Hyunju and how she had been drawn to the forest. I had to find out what was going on, for her sake. With a deep breath, I stepped inside the cabin. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and dust particles floated in the air, illuminated by the beam of my flashlight. Inside, the cabin was even more unsettling. There were signs of recent activity: empty food cans, a worn blanket on the floor, and scratches on the walls. It looked as if someone had been living there recently, but who? And why was this place so connected to the strange happenings around my daughter? As I explored the cabin, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tacked to the wall was a crudely drawn map of the forest, marked with strange symbols and notes. One of the symbols was right where our house stood. My mind raced with questions. Had someone been watching us? Was this connected to the calls Hyunju had heard? The atmosphere was heavy with a sense of dread, and I knew I had to find answers before it was too late. I was about to leave the cabin when I heard a noise from outside. It was a low, guttural sound that made my heart pound in my chest. I stopped, straining to listen, but the sound had stopped. I shone my flashlight through the broken windows, but all I saw were shadows and mist. My mind raced with the possible explanations for what I had heard. Maybe it was just an animal or the wind, but deep down, I felt something was wrong. Something that went beyond natural explanations. I knew I had to get back to Hyunju and make sure she was safe. As I stepped out of the cabin, the fog seemed even thicker than before. The air was cold and every sound was magnified. I felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't see anything through the dense mist. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I was engulfed in darkness. I took a deep breath and forced myself to keep moving. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, I saw the cabin's faint outline behind me. I turned back and saw no one, but the sense of being followed wouldn't leave me. The eerie feeling clung to me, making every rustle of leaves and crack of branches sound ominous. I rushed back to the house, my pace quickening with each step. When I opened the door, Hyunju was waiting for me, her face pale and her eyes wide. I could see she was scared, and my heart ached for her. I tried to reassure her, but the fear in her eyes told me she had felt something too. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was hiding something. I locked all the doors and windows, and we both stayed awake, listening to the sounds outside. Every little noise made us jump, and the silence that followed was just as unsettling. I knew whatever was out there wasn't just a figment of our imagination. It was real, and it was watching us. I'm Brandon, and I've spent most of my life as a firefighter in Yellowstone. I thought I had everything under control until one day I learned I had a daughter I didn't know existed. Isabella, a 7-year-old girl, had been left in a basket at a gas station in California when she was a baby. Her mother abandoned her, and she'd been in the system ever since. I was stunned when I got the call. I never imagined I'd be a father, let alone to a child who'd been through so much. I decided to take Isabella in, despite the whirlwind of emotions and the enormity of the responsibility. The first few months were a learning curve. Isabella was a bright, cheerful girl who seemed to adapt quickly to her new life. She was always full of energy, eager to talk about her day and share her dreams. It felt like she was just what I needed to fill the empty spaces in my life. As time went on, we formed a strong bond. I loved seeing her smile, and it made me realize how much I missed out on by not being there for her from the start. I wanted to make up for lost time, so I planned a special trip to Yellowstone National Park. I thought it would be a perfect opportunity for us to create lasting memories together. We packed our gear and headed out for 4 nights of camping in the park. The first 3 nights went off without a hitch. We enjoyed hiking, fishing, and cooking meals over the campfire. Isabella was in her element, thrilled to be exploring the great outdoors. Her laughter and excitement filled the air, and for a while, everything felt right. I felt like I was finally doing something right as a father. But on the last night, something changed. Isabella's usual enthusiasm seemed to wane. She grew quieter and more withdrawn. At first, I thought she was just tired from the trip, but as the night went on, her behavior became increasingly unsettling. She wouldn't talk much and seemed lost in her own thoughts. I brushed it off, hoping it was just a temporary phase. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of something much darker. 2 weeks after our camping trip, Isabella's behavior took a turn for the worse. At first, it was subtle. She'd get lost in her own world and wouldn't respond when I called her. Then it became more noticeable. She stopped talking as much and became unusually quiet. I was worried, but I chalked it up to the stress of adjusting to a new life and the recent trip. One night, around 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound coming from Isabella's room. I tiptoed down the hallway and found her standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. Her face was pale, and her eyes had an intensity I'd never seen before. I gently asked her what she was doing. She didn't answer, just kept pointing toward the window with an eerie calmness. I tried to see what had caught her attention, but the night was too dark to make out much. The only thing I could see was a vague shadow near the edge of our yard, where the trees stood thick and close together. I didn't see anything specific, but the feeling of unease settled in my stomach. I tried to reassure Isabella and gently guided her back to bed, but she seemed distant, her mind elsewhere. The next few days were filled with a heavy silence. Isabella was still withdrawn, and it felt like a wall had gone up between us. I reached out to a child psychologist, hoping they could help her adjust or figure out what was going on. The sessions didn't seem to make much difference. If anything, Isabella became even more reserved. One evening, I found her at the window again, this time during daylight. She wasn't pointing, but was standing there, watching the trees with the same unsettling focus. I asked her if she saw something, but she just shook her head. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The more I tried to understand her behavior, the less I felt I could help her. It was as if she was waiting for something I couldn't see or comprehend. The tension in our home grew unbearable. Isabella's silence was oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided to investigate the area around our house, thinking that maybe a practical issue could be causing her distress. What I found only deepened the mystery. The feeling of dread that had been creeping in since our return seemed to have a source, one I couldn't quite identify, but I was determined to uncover. I decided to take a closer look at the area around our house to see if I could find anything unusual. During the day, I walked around the yard, scanning for any signs of disturbances. I checked the fence, the trees, and the ground, but found nothing that would explain Isabella's sudden change in behavior. It was as if the shadows themselves had seeped into our lives, leaving no physical trace. One afternoon, I took Isabella with me for a walk through the woods near our property. I thought that maybe a change of scenery would help her feel more at ease. We walked in silence, the trees towering over us, their branches swaying gently. Isabella seemed detached, not engaging with me or her surroundings. Her gaze was fixed on the ground as if she were lost in thought. I tried to make conversation, but her responses were brief and distant. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the house and rustle of the leaves outside felt magnified. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I checked on Isabella several times, each time finding her curled up in bed, her face obscured by the covers. Her breathing was steady, but something in the way she seemed so still made me uneasy. I began to notice small things that added to my concern. Isabella started avoiding certain rooms in the house, and she seemed particularly unsettled in the basement. I asked her if something was wrong, but she would only shake her head and refuse to speak. It was like she was hiding something, but I couldn't figure out what it could be. One evening, I was sitting in the living room when I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the basement. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was persistent. I went downstairs to check, but the basement was empty. I turned on the lights and looked around, but found nothing. The tapping had stopped as soon as I arrived, leaving me with an uneasy feeling. Over the following days, Isabella's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She would have sudden bursts of fear, and her once lively demeanor was replaced by a tense silence. I decided to investigate the area around the house again, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain the shadowy figure I had seen. I felt like I was on the edge of uncovering something important, but the answers remained elusive. The tension in the house reached a breaking point as Isabella's behavior continued to shift. She would sit in her room for hours, staring blankly at the wall. When she did speak, her voice was almost a whisper, carrying an edge of fear that sent chills down my spine. I felt helpless, unsure of how to reach her or alleviate her fears. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard Isabella's voice coming from the hallway. I went to check on her, finding her standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. Her face was expressionless, and she seemed to be in a trance. I gently asked her what was wrong, but she didn't respond. Instead, she pointed outside with a trembling hand. I followed her gaze and looked out the window. There, just beyond the edge of the yard, I saw a large shadow moving slowly among the trees. It was difficult to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. It seemed to shift and change as if it were alive. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I tried to shake off the fear and reasoned with myself that it could be an animal or a trick of the light. But the shadow moved with a deliberate, almost intelligent intent that unnerved me. I wanted to investigate further, but the thought of leaving Isabella alone in the house made me hesitate. I decided to stay inside, but the shadow remained etched in my mind. The next day, I contacted a local ranger, hoping for some advice or reassurance. I described the shadow and Isabella's strange behavior, but he seemed skeptical. He mentioned that it could be a wild animal or a natural phenomenon and suggested I stay vigilant. His nonchalant response did little to ease my growing anxiety. As the days passed, the shadow continued to appear at night, always just outside the window. Isabella became more withdrawn, and her fear was palpable. I tried to comfort her and assure her that nothing was wrong, but it felt like the house itself was conspiring against us. The shadow seemed to be more than just a figment of our imaginations, and I was growing increasingly desperate to uncover the truth. I couldn't ignore it any longer. My concern for Isabella grew every day, and I knew I had to find out what was lurking outside our window. One night, with a flashlight in hand and a sense of dread, I decided to confront whatever was casting that shadow. I told Isabella to stay in her room and locked the door behind me, hoping she would be safe. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a wall. The moon was full, casting an eerie light over the yard and the surrounding forest. I moved cautiously toward the edge of the yard, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The shadow was gone, but my gut told me it was still nearby. I felt a sense of being watched, and every crackle of the underbrush made me flinch. I slowly made my way into the trees, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The forest seemed unusually still, the usual sounds of night creatures absent. My footsteps were muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. I was about to give up when I spotted something unusual, a small, partially buried box hidden among the roots of a large tree. It was old and covered in dirt, as though it had been there for a long time. My hands shook as I brushed off the dirt and opened the box. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs and a few personal items. Nothing that directly explained the shadow, but something about it felt wrong. The photographs showed people I didn't recognize, but they all had an unsettling look in their eyes, as if they were pleading for help. As I examined the contents of the box, I heard a rustling behind me. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. My heart pounded as I felt the oppressive weight of being watched. I quickly returned to the house, carrying the box with me. I needed to get to the bottom of this, and I hoped that the box might hold some clues. The next day, I took the box to a local historian, hoping they might shed light on its origins. She looked at the photographs with a grave expression and told me that the people in them had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. She mentioned a local legend about a cursed family who had lived in the area and vanished without a trace. Her words sent a chill down my spine, as they seemed to confirm that our house was somehow connected to these unsettling events. I returned home with more questions than answers, the shadow now a haunting reminder of the darkness that seemed to envelop us. After the accident, I needed a change, a complete escape from everything that reminded me of what I lost. I left New York City behind and found a farmhouse in Yellowstone, a place far removed from the chaos and memories of my old life. The isolation seemed perfect, a chance to be alone with my thoughts and start fresh. The farmhouse was tucked away, surrounded by a dense forest and a river that ran past the property. It was exactly what I was looking for, or at least what I thought I needed. I spent the first few weeks settling in and trying to adapt to my new life. My days quickly fell into a routine. I would fish in the river early in the morning and hunt in the forest later in the day. The quiet was both soothing and unsettling. I wanted to appreciate the solitude, but the emptiness of the house and the silence of the woods felt oppressive at times. The work on the farm was physical and demanding, which helped me focus my mind away from the constant ache of loss. I busied myself with fixing up the old barn, tending to the small garden, and learning the nuances of the land. Everything seemed manageable, even though the memories of my wife and children lingered just below the surface of my thoughts. Gradually, though, I began to notice something strange. There were moments when the forest seemed almost too quiet, as if it was holding its breath. It wasn't just the silence that got to me. It was the way the trees stood like sentinels, their branches heavy and still. I tried to push these thoughts aside, telling myself it was just the loneliness getting to me. I kept busy, determined to make this place my own. But it was hard to ignore the feeling that something was different here, something I couldn't quite put into words. The forest, while beautiful, felt oddly intimidating. It was as if it was watching me, waiting for me to uncover something that I wasn't ready to face. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, but deep down, I knew that there was more to this place than met the eye. It started slowly, a whisper of something familiar in the stillness of the forest. At first, I thought I was just hearing things. It was a soft, almost melodic voice calling my name. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to the isolation and the stress of starting over. But the voice didn't go away. It grew clearer, more insistent, and each time I heard it, it seemed to come from deeper within the forest. One morning, as I was fishing by the river, the voice called out again. This time, it sounded like a distant echo, faint but unmistakable. I looked around expecting to see someone, but the riverbank was empty. I convinced myself it was a trick of the mind, something my grief was conjuring up. The voice was too faint to be real, too surreal to be taken seriously. Over the next few days, the voice grew louder. It became a constant presence, calling me from the dense forest whenever I was alone. I could hear it clearly when I was working outside or sitting by the fire at night. It felt as if it was drawing me toward a specific part of the forest, where the trees grew closer together, forming a thick barrier. The more I heard it, the more my curiosity grew. I couldn't ignore the pull. One evening, driven by a mix of fear and intrigue, I decided to follow the voice. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the forest, pushing through the dense underbrush. The deeper I went, the more the sound seemed to shift. It was no longer a single voice. Now I could hear multiple voices, indistinct but pleading. The forest seemed to close in around me, and every step felt like it took me further from reality. I reached a clearing surrounded by tall trees that seemed to block out the sky. The voices were louder here, almost overwhelming. I searched the area, but there was nothing visible, no sign of anyone or anything that could explain the sounds. The air was heavy, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I turned back, uneasy and confused, but determined to understand what was happening. When I returned home, the voices stopped. For a while, I didn't hear them again, but the silence that followed was unsettling. It was as if the forest was waiting for me to return, to uncover whatever it was that had been calling out to me. I knew I needed to find answers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest held secrets I wasn't prepared to face. As days went by, I tried to focus on my routines, hoping the unsettling voices would stay away. But the peace didn't last. The whispers returned, and they were stronger than before. They seemed to follow me, whether I was hunting in the woods or just trying to relax at home. It was like being trapped in a nightmare that never ended. One evening, while I was preparing dinner, I heard the voices again, clearer and more urgent. I couldn't ignore them any longer. I decided to head back to the clearing, the place where the voices had been the loudest. I was anxious, but also determined to get to the bottom of this mystery. I took my flashlight and a few supplies, setting off as the sun began to set. The forest felt different that night, more oppressive and dark. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches twisting into strange shapes. As I made my way to the clearing, the voices grew louder, more frantic. It was as if they were guiding me, pulling me toward something hidden in the shadows. My flashlight's beam danced across the trees, revealing nothing but the darkness. When I reached the clearing, I noticed something new. There were strange markings on the trees, like old symbols or warnings. They were carved into the bark, faded and barely visible. I couldn't make sense of them, but they added to the eerie feeling. The voices were now a cacophony, mixing together in a haunting chorus. I felt a chill run down my spine. I heard a sound behind me, and I spun around, flashlight sweeping through the darkness. There was nothing there, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I took a deep breath and stepped closer to the center of the clearing. The ground felt different here, like it was disturbed or unsettled. I began to dig, driven by an overwhelming urge to find out what was causing these voices. After what felt like hours, I unearthed a small, weathered box. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were old photographs and letters, mementos from a family that had lived in the house before me. The faces in the photographs were familiar, mirrors of my own grief. It hit me hard. The voices, the whispers, they weren't just echoes of my past. They were tied to this land, to the previous occupants who had suffered a similar fate. The realization left me shaken. I understood that the voices were a reflection of my own pain, intertwined with the sorrow of those who had come before me. The forest wasn't just a place of solitude, it was a repository of lost souls, each one calling out for recognition. I needed to leave, but I also felt a deep connection to the place. I knew I had to confront my past, but the haunting truth was more than I could bear. I couldn't sleep that night. The box with the photographs and letters sat beside me on the kitchen table, its presence a constant reminder of the pain that seemed to seep from the very land. I went over the letters, trying to piece together the lives of the family who had lived here before me. Each word felt like a glimpse into a tragedy I hadn't lived but was somehow part of. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. I needed to understand more about the family to see if their story could offer any clues to what was happening. I drove into the nearest town, hoping to find old records or anyone who might remember them. The townsfolk were wary, but after some persistent questioning, I found an elderly woman who had known the family. She told me their story, how they had lost their lives in a car accident not far from here. The details were hauntingly familiar. The way she described their home, their lives, mirrored my own sense of loss and isolation. I realized that my need to escape and my choice of this place had linked me to them in ways I hadn't expected. When I returned to the farm, I noticed a new development. The whispers had intensified, and they were no longer just voices. They felt like a presence, one that was more than just a figment of my imagination. I started seeing fleeting shadows at the edge of my vision, and hearing footsteps when I was alone. It was as if the grief of the past was manifesting itself in tangible forms. One night, I heard a knock on the door. It was a sound that seemed to come from inside my head, but it was persistent. I opened the door, but there was no one there. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness. The shadows seemed to move, playing tricks on my mind. I followed them into the woods, feeling a sense of dread I couldn't shake. The further I went, the more intense the feeling became. The trees seemed to close in on me, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. I stumbled upon an old, decaying cabin I hadn't seen before. The sight was jarring. It looked like something from a nightmare. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. Inside, I found remnants of another life, furniture covered in dust and cobwebs, and a few personal items that hinted at a family once filled with love. The discovery hit me hard. It was as if I had stumbled upon the final piece of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. The cabin was a stark reminder of how the past never truly leaves us. I knew then that I needed to make a decision. I had come here to escape my grief, but it seemed that the land held onto its own sorrows. The past and present were intertwined in ways that were too painful to ignore. The cabin's haunting presence stayed with me long after I left. I returned to the farmhouse, feeling a mix of fear and determination. I had to get to the bottom of this, no matter how unsettling it was. I spent the next few days digging through the documents I had found and searching for any more clues. The more I learned about the previous owners, the more I saw parallels to my own life, parallels that were deeply unsettling. One evening, I came across an old journal tucked away in a dusty drawer. It belonged to the man who had lived here before me. As I read through his entries, it became clear that he had experienced the same eerie phenomena. His writings were filled with descriptions of whispers in the dark and shadows that seemed to move on their own. It was almost as if he was narrating my own recent experiences. His last entry was the most chilling. He wrote about feeling a growing sense of dread and realizing that he couldn't escape the past. He mentioned hearing his family calling him from the woods, just like I had heard mine. His words ended abruptly, leaving a sense of unresolved terror that mirrored my own growing fear. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. The weight of the past, the voices, the shadows, the inexplicable events, was too much to bear. It was clear that the farmhouse and the land were bound to something dark and unrelenting. I felt as though I was being drawn into a cycle of grief and fear that had trapped the previous owner and was now ensnaring me. Packing up my belongings was a somber task. Every corner of the house seemed to hold a memory, both mine and those of the family who had lived here before. I took one last look around, trying to find some comfort in the familiar, but all I saw were echoes of sorrow. The shadows in the house seemed to grow longer, as if they were reluctant to let me leave. As I drove away, the sense of finality was overwhelming. I glanced back at the farmhouse one last time, the feeling of dread lifting slightly but leaving a lasting impact. I had hoped to escape my grief and start anew, but instead I found myself entangled in a history that was far darker than I had imagined. I left Yellowstone behind, vowing never to return, and with a newfound understanding that some places are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried in the past. There's a certain rhythm to life on the ranch that I've always appreciated. The sun rises early, and the work is steady, but the quiet and isolation give me a peace I never found anywhere else. After years in the military, this place became my sanctuary. Sophia and I carved out a life here, far from the noise of the world. We've got a small herd of cattle, a few horses, and enough land to keep us busy but not overwhelmed. It's hard work, but it's honest, and we're proud of what we've built. But lately, something's been off. It started small, just a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard something outside, but when I'd get up to check, everything seemed normal. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, the cattle started disappearing. The first one, I figured, was just a fluke. Maybe it wandered off or got caught in some brush. But then another went missing, and then another. 3 in as many days. I searched the entire property, but there was no sign of them. No broken fence, no tracks leading away. Just gone. I could feel the tension building in my gut. Something wasn't right, and I needed to find out what. I decided to check the edges of the forest that borders the ranch. That's when I found the tracks. Big ones, much larger than anything I've seen around here. And there was blood. A thin trail that led deeper into the woods. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but these tracks were different. They didn't fit the pattern I knew, and that unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, it wasn't just passing through. It felt like it was watching, waiting. Sophia noticed I was on edge, but I didn't want to worry her. I told her I was just tired, but I knew I needed to do more than just look over the fence. This was our home, and I wasn't about to let anything threaten it. The next morning, I woke up early and headed out to the forest where I found the tracks. The air was colder than usual, and there was a stillness that made me uneasy. I followed the trail of blood further into the woods, my rifle slung over my shoulder. The trees were dense, and the shadows seemed to stretch out longer than they should have. As I moved deeper, the tracks became more erratic, almost like whatever I was following had started to stagger. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, hoping to catch a sound, anything to tell me I wasn't alone. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. I kept going, driven by a mix of fear and determination. I had to know what was out here, what was taking my cattle. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being drawn into something I didn't understand. After about an hour, I found what I was looking for. The trail ended at a small clearing. In the center, I saw what was left of one of my cows. It had been torn apart, but what caught my eye were the markings on the ground around it. They weren't like anything I'd seen before, strange symbols, almost like scratches, but too deliberate to be random. The whole scene made my skin crawl. This wasn't the work of any animal I knew. I crouched down to get a better look, but I didn't stay long. The smell was overpowering, and the silence was unnerving. As I stood up to leave, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, something big, just beyond the tree line, moving quickly and quietly. My heart raced as I raised my rifle, but whatever it was had already disappeared into the trees. I didn't follow it. I wasn't about to chase after something I couldn't even see. Instead, I turned back toward the ranch, my mind racing. This wasn't just a wild animal. This was something else, something that didn't belong out here. I needed to get back to Sophia to make sure she was safe. As I walked back, I kept thinking about those strange symbols. I'd never seen anything like them before, and I had no idea what they meant. But one thing was clear. Whatever was out there, it was more dangerous than I'd thought. Back at the ranch, I tried to shake off the unease, but it clung to me like a shadow. I found Sophia in the kitchen, sipping her morning coffee. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes searching mine for answers I didn't have. I sat down across from her, the weight of what I'd seen out there heavy on my shoulders. "I found another one," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Torn apart, same as the others, but this time, there were markings around it. Not like animal tracks, something different, almost like symbols." Sophia's expression shifted, concern etched on her face. "Symbols? What do you mean?" I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words felt inadequate. I told her about the strange, deliberate marks on the ground, how they seemed too precise to be random. She listened, her face pale. Sophia wasn't one to scare easily, but I could see the fear in her eyes now. She knew, just as I did, that this wasn't something we could easily explain away. We talked about what to do next. I mentioned installing more cameras around the property, maybe even setting up a few traps. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't be enough. Whatever was out there wasn't just some wild animal. It was something different, something we couldn't predict or control. And that scared me more than anything. As the day wore on, I tried to busy myself with work around the ranch, but my mind kept drifting back to the clearing, to those markings in the dirt. I felt like I was piecing together a puzzle with no clear picture to guide me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about the land we were living on. Yellowstone was vast, ancient, and full of secrets, secrets that were now creeping up to our doorstep. That night, as I lay in bed beside Sophia, sleep wouldn't come. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. Every creak, every gust of wind outside set my nerves on edge. I couldn't help but think about what I'd seen that morning, the thing that had moved through the trees like a ghost. It was out there, somewhere, waiting, and I had no idea what it wanted or what it would do next. The following morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. Sophia had already left the bed, and I could hear the faint clatter of dishes in the kitchen. I forced myself to get up, the unease from the night before still clinging to me. I dressed quickly and headed outside, determined to find some answers. The air was crisp, with a biting chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I walked the perimeter of the ranch, checking the fences and scanning the tree line. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but there was a tension in the air that I couldn't shake. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I made my way to the spot where I'd found the last carcass, the image of those symbols still fresh in my mind. The ground was undisturbed, the markings gone as if they'd never existed. I crouched down, running my fingers over the earth, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. But there was nothing. No signs, no tracks, just the cold, hard ground beneath my hands. Frustration bubbled up inside me, mixing with the fear that had been gnawing at me for days. I couldn't let this go on any longer. I needed to know what was out there, what was threatening our home. I decided then and there to set up more cameras to cover every inch of the ranch. If something or someone was stalking us, I'd catch it on film. That afternoon, I spent hours rigging up the cameras, positioning them in strategic spots around the property. Sophia helped me, her face set in a determined frown. We didn't speak much, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. We were in this together, and we'd do whatever it took to protect our home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, I felt a sense of grim resolve settle over me. Whatever was out there, it was going to make a move soon. I could feel it, and when it did, we'd be ready. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and rustle outside. The ranch was too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little noise. I could hear Sophia breathing beside me, steady and calm, but I knew she wasn't truly at ease. Neither of us were. Around midnight, I finally gave up on sleep and slipped out of bed. I grabbed my boots and jacket and headed outside, careful not to wake her. The night air was sharp against my skin as I stepped onto the porch. The ranch stretched out before me, bathed in the pale light of the moon. Everything was still. I made my way to the barn, where I'd set up a small monitor to check the camera feeds. My hands were steady as I flipped through the channels, scanning the footage for any sign of movement. The fields were empty, the tree line dark and unbroken. But then, on the last camera, something caught my eye. A shadow, large and indistinct, moved at the edge of the frame. It was quick, just a blur of darkness against the trees, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I rewound the footage, watching it again and again, but the shape remained elusive. It was there one moment, gone the next, like a trick of the light. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Whatever it was big, bigger than any animal I'd seen around here. And it was fast, too fast for me to identify. My thoughts spiraled, every worst-case scenario flashing through my mind. But one thing was certain, it was out there, and it wasn't afraid to get close. I switched off the monitor. The image of that shadow burned into my mind. I knew what I had to do. Tomorrow, I'd set the traps, reinforce the cameras, do whatever it took to catch this thing. I wouldn't rest until I had answers. As I stood there in the barn, the weight of it all pressing down on me, I realized this was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning. I moved to Wyoming a few months ago. Iowa, with its familiar streets and constant reminders of my wife, had become unbearable. Every corner, every sound, brought back memories that I couldn't escape. Yellowstone had always been our place, where we could breathe and just be. That's why I chose this ranch, tucked away from everything, but close enough to the park. It felt like the only place where I could start over, where her presence wouldn't haunt me at every turn. The ranch itself is nothing special. Just a simple house on a stretch of land bordered by trees. It's quiet here, and that's what I wanted. I needed the silence, a place to clear my head. At first, it was exactly what I hoped for. The days were long and peaceful, filled with the sounds of the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. But the nights were different. The nights brought a kind of quiet that pressed in on me, making the loneliness almost tangible. It was during one of those nights that I first saw her. I was standing by the window, staring out at the dark shapes of the trees, when I noticed something moving. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but then I saw the shape, a woman dressed in white, walking slowly across the field. She moved as if she was gliding, her figure almost blending into the mist that was starting to rise from the ground. My heart stopped for a moment, and I remember thinking that maybe I was dreaming, or maybe it was the grief playing tricks on my mind. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, staring out the window, waiting for the woman to reappear. But she didn't. The next day, I tried to push it out of my mind, convincing myself that it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But the image of her kept creeping back into my thoughts, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. It was like she was still out there, waiting for me to notice her again. The following night, I saw her again. This time, she was closer to the trees, standing still, facing the house. There was something unsettling about the way she stood there, motionless, as if she was waiting for something. I wanted to go outside, to see her up close, to prove to myself that she wasn't real. But something held me back, a deep, gut-wrenching fear that I couldn't shake. So I just watched her from the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, wondering if I was losing my mind. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked around the property, trying to find any sign of the woman I'd seen. The grass was damp with morning dew, but there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. It didn't make sense. She had to be real, I told myself. But as much as I searched, I found nothing. Just the quiet of the early morning and the weight of the previous night hanging over me. I went about my day as usual, but the memory of her lingered. Her white dress, the way she moved, it was all too vivid. I kept thinking about her standing near the trees, how she had seemed to be looking at the house, or at me. I couldn't understand why she was there, or why she kept returning. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. There was a nagging thought at the back of my mind that maybe I wasn't alone out here, that maybe something had followed me from Iowa, something I couldn't see during the day. That night, I didn't want to look out the window. I tried to distract myself with a book, with the radio, with anything that would keep me from thinking about her. But I couldn't stop myself. Eventually, I went back to the window, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. And there she was, closer than before. This time she wasn't near the trees. She was in the middle of the field, her face turned toward the house, her body almost translucent in the pale moonlight. I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at her, feeling that same fear grip me. Then I heard it. A soft voice, almost a whisper, coming from the direction of the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear what it was saying. At first, the words were muffled, like they were coming from a great distance. But then they became clearer, and I realized it wasn't just any voice. It was my wife's voice. She was calling my name, just like she used to when we were out in Yellowstone together. The sound of it sent chills down my spine. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but it felt too real, too close. I backed away from the window, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind was racing, but no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, nothing made sense. My wife was gone, and yet her voice was in my ears, clear as day. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like the line between the living and the dead was blurring. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat in the living room, staring at the walls, listening for her voice, wondering if the woman in white would appear again. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind set me on edge, making me jump. When morning finally came, I felt like I'd been through a war. My nerves were shot, and my body ached from the tension. But the daylight brought a strange sense of relief, as if the night before had been a bad dream. Still, I couldn't forget the voice, or the woman. They were connected somehow, and I knew I couldn't keep ignoring it. Something was happening on this ranch, something beyond my understanding, and I had to figure out what it was, even if it meant facing whatever was out there. I started looking into the history of the property, hoping to find something that might explain the strange occurrences. The local library had some old records and news clippings about the area. One afternoon, I sat at a dusty desk, flipping through yellowed pages, searching for any clue. I came across an old article about a family who had lived on this land decades ago. It mentioned a woman who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Her name was Emily, and she had vanished one night, never to be seen again. The article hinted at local legends about hauntings and strange happenings, but nothing concrete. As I read, I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily and the woman in white were connected. The descriptions were eerie. Emily had been reported to wear a white dress often. The more I read, the more my anxiety grew. The story matched the details of what I'd seen, and I began to wonder if I was living in the midst of a ghost story that had been waiting for someone to uncover it. I decided to investigate further. If there were any more clues, I needed to find them. That evening, I saw the woman in white again, but this time, she wasn't alone. A dark shape seemed to move beside her, blending into the shadows. I tried to make out what it was, but the darkness made it difficult. The figure was large, and its movements were erratic, like it was dragging something behind it. The woman didn't seem to acknowledge its presence, but it felt menacing. My heart raced as I watched from the window, struggling to understand what I was seeing. The next day, I decided to set up cameras around the ranch, hoping to catch something on film. I installed them near the windows, the fields, and along the edge of the forest where I'd seen the woman. The cameras were equipped with motion sensors, and I hoped they'd capture whatever was causing these disturbances. As I worked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling an uneasy sensation that I was being watched. The silence around me was heavy, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. That night, I checked the footage from the cameras. I replayed hours of blank screens, only to find the footage from around midnight strangely distorted. The image was fuzzy, but I could make out vague shapes moving in the dark. The woman appeared several times, walking through the field with the dark shape trailing behind her. Each time she neared the trees, the image would cut out, and the camera would briefly lose signal. It was as if something was interfering with the equipment. The more I watched, the more convinced I became that something was terribly wrong. I could see glimpses of the dark figure, but its form remained elusive. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen, and the more I tried to understand it, the more it slipped through my grasp. I felt a growing sense of dread, as if I was on the brink of discovering something I wasn't meant to know. With each passing day, the house seemed to become darker, and I could feel the tension thickening. I knew I had to do something, but what could I possibly do against something I couldn't even clearly see? The mystery deepened, and so did my fear. I decided I needed to confront whatever was haunting me head-on. The distortions in the camera footage were unsettling, but I couldn't just sit back and let it control my life. I gathered my tools and set out for the edge of the forest where the cameras had caught the most activity. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the trees, and I felt a chill creeping over me. As I walked, I saw the spot where the woman in white had been seen most frequently. The trees here were dense, their branches twisted and gnarled, blocking out much of the fading light. I placed some additional motion-activated lights and cameras in the area, hoping to get clearer footage. I set up the equipment carefully, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease in my stomach. I decided to wait and watch from the safety of the house, hoping the new setup would capture more details. That night, I reviewed the footage with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. To my dismay, the cameras showed the woman in white again, moving through the trees with the dark figure following her. The footage was clearer, but the dark figure remained indistinct, like a shadow with no form. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. At one point, the figure seemed to stop and look directly at the camera. It was brief, but the eyes, if they could be called that, appeared to glow with an unnatural light. I jumped back from the screen, feeling a wave of terror. It was as if whatever was in the forest knew I was watching. I couldn't understand why this was happening or what it meant, but it was becoming clear that it wasn't just a random occurrence. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jump. Every creak in the house felt like it came from something sinister. I decided to head outside, armed with a flashlight and a camera, hoping to find some answers or at least get a better look at the mysterious figure. I crept through the darkened fields toward the edge of the forest, each step feeling like it was leading me deeper into a nightmare. As I approached the trees, the forest seemed to close in around me. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced among the branches. I scanned the area, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard a faint whisper, like someone calling my name. It was soft, almost gentle, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I swung the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but saw only the oppressive darkness. My heart raced as I quickly made my way back to the house, feeling like something was just out of sight, watching me. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge and unsure of what was real. I had to find a way to end this nightmare, or at least understand what was happening. The sense of dread was overwhelming, and I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Whatever was in the forest, it seemed to be closing in on me, and I needed to find a way to protect myself and uncover the truth behind these haunting experiences. The following day, I decided to take a different approach. I needed to get to the bottom of this, so I reached out to the local historical society to see if they had any information about the land or its previous occupants. I hoped there might be some clues about the strange occurrences I was experiencing. The lady at the historical society was helpful. She mentioned that the property I had bought once belonged to a family who had disappeared mysteriously decades ago. They were well known in the area, and their disappearance had never been fully explained. Hearing this, I felt a chill run down my spine. It seemed like there might be a connection between their disappearance and what was happening to me. Armed with this new information, I decided to investigate further. I spent the rest of the day researching everything I could about the old owners. I found old newspaper articles and even visited the small cemetery where some of their family members were buried. I hoped that maybe understanding their story would shed light on what was haunting me. That night, I returned home, feeling more determined but still deeply unsettled. I set up more cameras around the property, hoping to catch anything unusual. As I reviewed the footage from the previous night, I noticed a pattern. The woman in white and the dark figure seemed to be moving toward a specific part of the forest. I decided I needed to investigate that spot more closely. I ventured into the forest again, guided by the footage. The area was thick with trees, and the air felt heavier than before. As I pushed through the underbrush, I stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin. It was barely standing, overgrown with weeds and vines. My heart pounded as I approached it, the sense of foreboding growing stronger. Inside the cabin, I found old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. On the wall, there was a faded photograph of a family that looked eerily familiar. It was the same family from the historical records. I felt a mix of fear and revelation. This was their place. I understood now why I had been haunted. This land was connected to their tragic story. I left the cabin, determined to leave the property and never return. The realization that I had been living in the midst of such a dark history was more than I could handle.